Hello, distance learners. I hope you guys are doing well today. It is Tuesday, October 6th. Today we are going to be talking about conclusions, or how we end our narrative stories. So conclusions in narrative writing, especially if you're writing a story about a personal experience, need to reflect back on the story you told in your essay. For example, or one way that this might sound would be, so when I look back on that day, I consider how lucky I am to have survived. From this experience, I learned, and then you would insert whatever moral lesson or thing that you learned from the experience. For example, one of my students in the hybrid classes is writing a story about the zombie apocalypse, and where he ends up being the last person alone in the world. It's a very interesting story, and at the end of his story, he's reflecting on what it is that he learned from the experience of being alone for so long, and how he came to realize that he is perfectly sufficient with himself as an individual. And then he also learned to be patient in situations where things are difficult. So those are the morals and things that he learned from this story, even though his story is something that is almost completely made up. So, as you're writing your narratives and you're choosing your prompts, which you should have done already, you guys are going to need to keep in mind that your conclusion or the ending to your story needs to be reflective. However, there is a small change or addendum to that. For some stories, it's not very easy to write a story where the ending is reflective. This is most often when a story is not told in the first person, meaning that it is told from the third person perspective, or he did this or she did that. So if you're writing a story where it's told in first person, saying that I went to the store or I experienced this, it's very easy to write a reflective conclusion. However, if you're writing in the third person, it can be a lot more difficult, especially if you have a lot of things going on in your story. So, the opposite of a reflective conclusion, or not necessarily the opposite, but an alternative to the reflective conclusion would be a conclusion that gives closure. Closure just means that it's the ending of the story, and the problems that you introduce throughout your story get solved and fixed at the end of the story. So, as you are writing your stories, you'll need to ask yourself, am I writing a story where a reflective conclusion makes sense, or am I writing a story where a story where the conclusion should just be one that ends the story? Which one makes more sense for me? The first question you can ask yourself is, what kind of story am I writing? Am I writing a story where I'm the main character? Am I writing a story where it's told in first person? Am I writing a story where it's about an actual experience that I've had? If you answered yes to any of those questions, you can write a reflective conclusion. However, if you are writing a story where it's in third person, or it's not about necessarily anything realistic that you could learn anything from, then you could write a story a conclusion that is just talking about what happens at the end and how the problems get fixed. All right, another question you can ask yourself is, my story personal or is it imagined? And by personal, I don't mean sharing details that are too personal. That's not what I mean. I never want people to share personal details that would make them uncomfortable or that you don't want to share at all. That's not what I mean. When I say personal, I just mean that it's based on something that happened in your life. That's all. If your story is based on things that happened in your real life, then you can write a reflective conclusion. However, if you're writing a story where all the events are imagined and not real, it might be more difficult to do so, and it might make more sense to write a conclusion that gives closure. All right, so let's look at some examples of that. If you have any questions about anything I say, as always, please reach out to me. All right, so right here, I want to read this conclusion at the bottom of this story here and talk about it briefly. It says, today I've learned to love old people for their innocence, for their knowledge. I've learned to always treat people with kindness, no matter how cruel they may seem. But mainly, I've learned that you must cherish the time spent with a person, and memories are very valuable. Because Miss Sadie no longer sits in her rocking chair on her porch on summer days, I'm glad that I can still see her. This here is an excellent example that was written by another seventh grader of a reflective conclusion. This conclusion talks about what they learned from their experience, And not only does it do that, it tells us tells us what they learned. And then it also tells us why that was what they learned. So it tells us that what they learned was to love old people. They know that we know that they learned this because, let me format this a little better, because of she loves them because of their innocence and their knowledge. Right. So we have our what, which is what she learned, and then it has her why. So when you write your reflective conclusion, you need to include what it is that you learned, and then why you learned that, or how that was what you learned. So your why or your how. So as you write your reflective conclusion, you should definitely can make sure you include your what and your why/how. All right, let's look at one more example here. This is another conclusion that was written by another 7th grader. It's the ending of the dust storm story, which is the one we looked at yesterday. It says, I wheezed, coughed, and barely breathed. I felt myself suffocating, remembering my name. Will myself, I would make it. You can do this, Mary. You can get out of this. I opened my mouth to scream, instead filling myself with gallons of dust in my throat and lungs. I realized I was finally back in the woods, almost reaching my terrified family. I took a huge rock and wrote with saliva and dust. My vision blurred and I tripped over tree branches, rocks, and anything in my way. I tumbled over my head, crashing on the ground. I felt myself suffocate before my head hit the rock, never seeing light or dust as my body shut down. So this one ends on an ominous note. We don't necessarily know if she's passed away or if she's just passed out. However, this does give closure to the story by ending it in a way that where some of the problems have been fixed and there's no way to follow our narrator anymore because they've passed out. So this here is an example of a conclusion that gives closure. We know this because while this one doesn't necessarily fix all of the problems in the story, it ends on a cliffhanger. So when you're writing a conclusion that gives closure, there are multiple ways you can do it. So you can end it like this one did on a cliffhanger. You can end it in a funny way. You could end it in a way where all the problems are fixed. Or you could end it in some sort of clever or interesting way. There are lots of different options for conclusions that give closure. There are some ideas if you need them. So remember, you need to add a conclusion that's reflective if you have the option to do so in your story, and you need to add a conclusion that ends your story and gives closure in one of these ways or in another way that you deem quality enough. All right, if you have any questions, as always, reach out to me and let me know. You guys have a great day.